The rain hit the pavement like shattered glass, but the freezing cold was nothing compared to the sharp, suffocating sting of the heavy oak door slamming in her face. Through the grand, arched windows of the historic Connecticut estate, Young watched her mother-in-law, Beatrice, smirking triumphantly, a crystal glass of Merlot in her perfectly manicured hand. Beside Beatrice stood David, the man who had stood at an altar and promised to protect Young, staring at the floor, cowardly, silent, and entirely complicit. They thought they had just discarded the trash. They thought they were the undisputed masters of the house. What Beatrice didn't know, what David was about to find out in the most devastating way possible, was that the deed to that very mansion, signed and sealed, was resting safely in Young's damp leather purse, and the eviction notice was already drafted. To understand how Young found herself shivering in the torrential downpour of a harsh October night, you have to understand the suffocating ecosystem of the Sterling family. The Sterlings were old Connecticut money, or at least, they desperately projected the illusion of it. Beatrice Sterling was the matriarch, a woman whose entire identity was entirely wrapped up in her surname, her country club membership, and the sprawling, ivy-covered walls of Sterling Manor. Young, on the other hand, was from a profoundly different world. She grew up in a middle-class suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Her father, Richard Hayes, was a quiet, unassuming man who spent his life tinkering in a dusty garage, while her mother had passed away when Young was just a teenager. Young was practical, hard-working, and deeply empathetic. When she met David Sterling at a university in Boston, she was charmed by his easygoing nature and polished manners. David was handsome, softly spoken, and seemed completely untethered from the snobbery of his lineage. But marriage changes the lens through which you view a person, and moving into Sterling Manor brought the reality of David's world into sharp, unforgiving focus. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until we find our own place in the city, David had promised, squeezing Young's hand as they drove through the wrought iron gates of the estate. But weeks bled into months, and months dissolved into 3 agonizing years. Beatrice made it her daily mission to remind Young that she was an interloper. The psychological warfare was relentless, cloaked in the polite, venomous language of high society. "Oh, Young dear," Beatrice would sigh at the dinner table, watching Young arrange the silverware. "We don't use the fish fork for the salad, but I suppose in Ohio, meals are more about sustenance than standard, aren't they?" Young would swallow her pride, offering a tight, polite smile. She endured the passive-aggressive comments about her clothes, her career as an independent accountant, and her lack of a proper pedigree. She endured it because she loved David. But David was a ghost of a husband when his mother was in the room. He was a man deeply conditioned by a lifetime of Beatrice's emotional manipulation. Whenever Young brought up the constant belittling behind closed doors, David would rub his temples and sigh. "You know how she is, Young. She's from a different generation. Just let it roll off your back. It's her house, after all." That was the phrase that echoed through the cavernous halls of the manor. It's her house. Beatrice wielded the estate like a weapon. The manor was an imposing, Gothic revival masterpiece, boasting 20 rooms, sweeping mahogany staircases, and a library filled with first editions. But if you looked closely, the cracks in the Sterling facade were glaring. The wallpaper in the east wing was peeling. The grand chandelier in the foyer was missing several crystal teardrops, and the plumbing groaned with an agonizing rattle every time a faucet was turned. Beatrice acted as though she commanded an army of servants, yet the reality was that she had fired the housekeeping staff years ago, citing incompetence. In truth, Young knew they couldn't afford them. Young became the unofficial maid, cook, and errand girl, managing the estate's upkeep while running her own remote accounting business. Young tolerated the exhaustion and the insults. She believed in the sanctity of her marriage and held on to the desperate hope that David would eventually stand up, take her hand, and lead them out of his mother's shadow. She didn't know that the shadow was about to swallow her whole. The twist in Young's life arrived silently, cloaked in tragedy and a thick stack of legal documents. In the second year of her marriage, Young received the devastating news that her father, Richard, had suffered a fatal heart attack. The grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket. David offered obligatory comfort, but it was Beatrice who made the funeral agonizing, loudly complaining about the dreadful humidity in Ohio and the appalling lack of decent catering at the wake. A month after the funeral, Young sat in the sleek, oak-paneled office of Arthur Pendleton, a gruff, fiercely intelligent patent lawyer who had represented her father for decades. Young had expected a modest life insurance policy, perhaps enough to finally put a down payment on a small house away from Beatrice. Instead, Arthur slid a manila folder across the desk. "Your father was a very private man, Young," Arthur said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "He was also a genius. Those components he was constantly tinkering with in the garage, he patented a specialized microvalve used in modern hydraulic aviation. 3 major aerospace corporations have been licensing it for the last 6 years." Young stared at the documents, her vision blurring. "What does that mean, Arthur?" "It means," Arthur said softly, "that after taxes, corporate fees, and the sale of the remaining patent rights, your father has left you an estate valued at roughly $22 million. The shock was absolute. Young was instantly launched into a stratosphere of wealth that made the Sterling family's old money look like pocket change. But Young was her father's daughter, pragmatic, quiet, and deeply averse to flashy displays of wealth. She decided to keep the inheritance a secret, transferring the funds into a secure, private trust. She wanted to figure out how to handle the money responsibly before telling David. But 2 weeks later, while organizing David's home office, Young found a letter shoved hastily into the back of a drawer. It bore the heavy, intimidating crest of a major national bank. It was a final notice of foreclosure. Young's heart pounded as she read the stark, unforgiving terms. David's late father had made a series of catastrophic investments, leveraging the manor to the hilt. The Sterlings were completely bankrupt. The estate was millions of dollars in debt, and the bank was seizing the property in 30 days. It was going to a private auction. When Young confronted David that evening, he broke down in tears. "My mother doesn't know the extent of it," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "If she loses this house, the scandal, the humiliation, it will literally kill her. We have nothing, Young. I'm a failure." Looking at her broken husband, Young made a monumental, fateful decision. She didn't reveal her newfound wealth to him. Instead, she contacted Arthur Pendleton the next morning. "I need to buy a house," Young told the lawyer over the phone, "and I need it done quietly." Arthur was vehemently opposed. "Young, I looked into the Sterling estate. You are buying a sinking ship for people who would gladly drown you to stay afloat. Let the bank take it. Let them face reality." "I love him, Arthur," Young pleaded. "If I buy it outright, the debt is cleared. David keeps his pride, Beatrice keeps her illusion, and I save my marriage. Please, set up a shell company." Within 2 weeks, an anonymous corporate entity named Oak and Ivy Holdings, LLC, of which Young was the sole owner and beneficiary, purchased the debt and bought Sterling Manor outright from the bank for $4.5 million. The bank notified David that a private investor had acquired the debt and, miraculously, had decided to halt the eviction indefinitely, granting them an unprecedented grace period. David wept with relief. Beatrice, entirely ignorant of how close she had come to living on the streets, simply adjusted her pearl necklace and said, "Well, of course they backed off. The bank knows better than to evict the Sterlings. The public outcry would be deafening." Young said nothing. She paid the property taxes, funded the hidden repairs, and covered the exorbitant utility bills from her private accounts, funneling the money subtly through David's joint account, so he thought his modest salary was somehow stretching further than ever. She was the invisible Atlas, holding up their world. She thought her sacrifice would buy peace. She was terribly, tragically wrong. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in late October, exactly 8 months after Young had secretly bought the manor. Beatrice had decided to host a lavish dinner party. The guests of honor were the Wellingtons, a notoriously wealthy and judgmental family from Newport. Beatrice viewed this dinner as her grand return to the pinnacle of local high society, a statement that the Sterlings were thriving. To fund the extravagant evening, Beatrice had secretly sold a pair of antique diamond earrings, though she loudly claimed the dinner was just a modest, casual get-together. She demanded perfection, and because she refused to hire caterers, claiming they lacked the refined touch of a home kitchen, the burden of cooking a five-course meal for 12 people fell squarely on Young's shoulders. Young spent 3 days prepping. She roasted a prime rib, whisked complex reductions, and polished the family silver until her fingers bled. On the night of the party, she was exhausted, her hair pulled back, wearing a simple black dress, moving frantically between the sweltering kitchen and the dining room. The atmosphere in the dining room was thick with pretension. Beatrice held court at the head of the table, laughing loudly, her glass constantly refilled. David sat near the middle, looking handsome, but playing the role of the quiet, obedient son. The disaster struck during the third course. Young was carrying a heavy, silver tray, bearing a delicate mushroom and truffle risotto. As she approached the table, Beatrice suddenly pushed her chair back, without looking. The heavy mahogany chair caught Young's knee. Young stumbled. She desperately tried to overcorrect, but the heavy silver tray tipped. A portion of the hot risotto slid off the edge, landing directly onto the lap of Mrs. Wellington's custom silk gown. The dining room descended into chaos. Mrs. Wellington shrieked, jumping up as the hot food ruined the expensive fabric. "Oh my God," Young gasped, immediately grabbing a linen napkin to help. "I am so incredibly sorry." "Don't touch her," Beatrice roared. The matriarch leaped to her feet, her face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The mask of polite society slipped entirely, revealing the pure malice underneath. "Beatrice, it was an accident. You bumped into my Young," started to explain. "Silence," Beatrice hissed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She turned to the horrified guests. "I must apologize for my daughter-in-law. She is clumsy, careless, and entirely unaccustomed to homes of this caliber. She belongs in a diner, not a dining room." Young felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at David, her eyes pleading for him to intervene, to say something, anything, to defend her. David looked at the ruined dress, then at his furious mother, and finally at Young. He swallowed hard, dropping his gaze to his plate. "Young," he muttered softly, not making eye contact, Just go back to the kitchen. You're embarrassing us." The betrayal was a physical blow. It hit Young harder than the exhaustion, harder than Beatrice's screaming. The man she had saved from financial ruin, the man she loved, was treating her like an insubordinate servant. Beatrice wasn't finished. Emboldened by David's cowardice, she marched up to Young, her eyes blazing. "I have tolerated your presence in my house for 3 years, Beatrice spat, her voice dripping with venom. "I have watched you drag my son down to your pitiful, working-class level. You are a parasite, Young. You contribute nothing to this family. You are nothing but a stain on the Sterling name." "Beatrice, that's enough," Young said, her voice shaking, but finding a sudden, solid edge. "It is my house, and I say when it is enough," Beatrice screamed. "Get out." The dining room went dead silent. Only the sound of the torrential rain, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, could be heard. "Excuse me?" Young whispered. "You heard me," Beatrice commanded, pointing a trembling finger toward the foyer. "Get out of my house. Now, I will not have you ruin this family for one more second." "David?" Young asked, her voice cracking. "Are you going to let her do this?" David finally stood up, looking deeply uncomfortable, but utterly spineless. "Look, Young, Mom is she's upset. The dress is ruined. Maybe it's best you go. Just for tonight. Go to a hotel in town. We'll talk tomorrow, when everyone has cooled down." "A hotel?" Young asked, a strange, terrifying calm washing over her. "You're throwing me out into a storm, David." "It's not my choice, Young. It's Mom's house," he whispered, stepping back. Beatrice grabbed Young by the arm, her grip shockingly strong, and dragged her toward the front door. Young didn't fight back. The sheer absurdity and heartbreak of the moment had paralyzed her. Beatrice yanked the heavy oak door open. The wind howled, driving sheets of freezing rain into the foyer. "Don't bother coming back tomorrow," Beatrice yelled over the thunder. She shoved Young hard, sending her stumbling out onto the wet stone portico. "My son is filing for divorce in the morning." Slam. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. Young stood on the porch, the freezing rain instantly soaking through her thin black dress. She looked through the window. She saw Beatrice apologizing to the guests, smiling warmly again. She saw David pouring another glass of wine, settling back into his chair as if a mild nuisance had just been removed from the room. The tears came then, hot and fast, mixing with the icy rain. She cried for the 3 years she had wasted. She cried for the love she had freely given to a man who possessed no spine. She cried for the utter humiliation. But as the cold seeped into her bones, the tears stopped. A profound, icy clarity replaced the heartbreak. She reached into her damp leather purse, miraculously still slung over her shoulder. Her fingers brushed past her car keys and settled on her cell phone. Young unlocked the screen and wiped the rainwater from the display. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Arthur," Young said, her voice steady, cutting through the sound of the storm. "It's Young." "Young? It's 9 at night. Are you all right? You sound freezing." Young looked up at the towering facade of Sterling Manor, the house she had bought, the house she owned. "Arthur," Young said, a sharp, dangerous smile slowly spreading across her face. "Draft the eviction notice. I want them out of my house by Friday." The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons in downtown Boston. Young sat in a plush velvet armchair, a stark contrast to the soaking wet stone porch she had been discarded on just 10 hours prior. She wore a crisp, white silk blouse and tailored trousers she had purchased from the hotel boutique at dawn. She looked nothing like the exhausted, subservient daughter-in-law who had scrubbed the Sterling Manor baseboards. She looked like exactly what she was, the sole owner of a $22 million empire. Across the glass coffee table sat Arthur Pendleton. The seasoned lawyer had taken the first train from Ohio, bringing with him a thick, leather-bound briefcase that held the financial lifeblood of the Sterling family. "They have absolutely no idea, do they?" Arthur asked, peering over his reading glasses as he laid out a series of legal documents. "None," Young replied, her voice eerily calm as she stirred her black coffee. "David sent me a text at 7 a.m. Would you like to hear it?" Arthur leaned back, crossing his arms. "Enlighten me." Young picked up her phone and read aloud. "Young, I hope you cooled off. Mom is still furious about Mrs. Wellington's dress. You need to come back this afternoon, apologize to her, and offer to pay for the dry cleaning. We can talk about our marriage after you make things right." Arthur let out a dry, humorless bark of a laugh. The audacity is almost structural. He throws you into a freezing rainstorm, and his primary concern is a dry cleaning bill for a woman who has more money than God. "That's David," Young said, setting the phone face down. "He has spent 32 years functioning as his mother's emotional bodyguard. I spent 3 years trying to save him from it. Now, I'm done saving him. Let's talk logistics, Arthur. How fast can we do this?" Arthur's eyes gleamed with the predatory thrill of a lawyer who knew he held an unbeatable hand. "I've already initiated the sequence. First, Oak and Ivy Holdings, LLC, is no longer a silent entity. As of 9 a.m. today, I have formally registered you as the sole managing director on all public-facing documents in the state of Connecticut. Second, I have frozen the joint checking account." Young nodded. For the last 8 months, she had been secretly transferring $5,000 a week into that account, just to keep Beatrice's extravagant grocery and country club bills from bouncing. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, tapping a manicured finger on a stack of invoices, "I have canceled the auto pay on the manor's electricity, water, and gas. The accounts are in Beatrice's name, but you've been quietly funding them. By noon today, the utility companies will realize the primary payment method is dead. They will demand the arrears Beatrice technically owes from the months before you stepped in. She is functionally entirely bankrupt, Young. She has $34 in her personal savings. And the eviction? Young asked, her heart beating a steady, relentless rhythm. Drafted, stamped, and legally binding, Arthur said, sliding a crisp piece of paper across the table. It bore the heavy seal of the state court. Because they sold the home to your LLC to avoid foreclosure, they are technically month-to-month tenants in a property you own entirely outright. Since there is no formal lease agreement in place, and considering the history of property neglect, which we have documented, Connecticut law allows us to serve a 2-hour notice to quit for termination of privilege. Young stared at the document. Notice to vacate. 3 words that carried the weight of 3 years of psychological torment. I want it served tomorrow, Young said. Friday morning, Beatrice hosts her weekly society brunch at 11 a.m. I want all of her friends to be sitting in my dining room when she finds out she doesn't own it. Arthur smiled, a rare, genuine expression. I'll call the local sheriff's department to escort the process server, just to ensure there is no breach of peace. Meanwhile, back at Sterling Manor, ignorance was blissfully, arrogantly reigning. Beatrice woke up at her leisure, ringing a small silver bell on her nightstand that Young usually answered with a fresh pot of Earl Grey. When Young didn't appear, Beatrice merely huffed, assuming the ungrateful girl was still sulking at some cheap motel. Downstairs, David was pacing the library, periodically checking his phone. Young hadn't replied to his text. A small knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach, but he quickly dismissed it. Young always forgave him. She was practical. She didn't have the funds to leave him, he reasoned. She would be back by dinner time, tail tucked between her legs, ready to make amends. Neither of them noticed that the internet had suddenly stopped working. Neither of them noticed the missed calls from the electric company. They were entirely consumed by the illusion of their own untouchable status, completely unaware that the ground beneath Sterling Manor had already shifted. Friday morning arrived with brilliant, crisp autumn sunshine, burning away the damp memory of Tuesday's storm. At exactly 10:45 a.m., Beatrice Sterling was holding court in the grand parlor. The antique silver tea service, polished by Young's bruised hands, just days ago, gleamed in the sunlight. Seated around Beatrice were Cynthia Harrison and Margaret DuPont, 2 of the wealthiest, most notorious gossips in Connecticut's elite social circle. Beatrice was in her element, wearing a Chanel suit and holding a crystal flute of mimosa. It's just been so exhausting, Cynthia, Beatrice sighed dramatically, waving a hand. I finally had to put my foot down. The girl simply lacked the refinement for this family. I told David, you cannot make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. I had to ask her to leave. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. You threw her out? Oh, Beatrice, how brave of you. But won't David be terribly lonely? David is a Sterling, Beatrice declared proudly. He will recover. He needs a woman of substance, someone with a proper background, not a glorified bookkeeper from Ohio. Upstairs, David was in his bedroom, frantically refreshing his banking app. His card had just been declined for a $40 online subscription. The screen kept flashing an error message. Account frozen. Please contact administrator. He gritted his teeth, assuming Young had petty canceled his card in a fit of rage. He decided he would deal with it after his mother's brunch concluded. At exactly 11 a.m., the heavy brass knocker on the front oak door slammed against the wood. The sound echoed through the cavernous foyer, loud enough to startle the women in the parlor. Ah, that must be the caterers with the petite fours, Beatrice said, setting her glass down. David, she shrilled toward the staircase. David, get the door. David hurried down the stairs, adjusting his collar. He swung the heavy door open, expecting to see a delivery boy. Instead, he was met by the imposing figure of Deputy Sheriff Thomas Miller, flanked by a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Can I help you, officer?" David asked, his polished smile faltering slightly. "David Sterling?" the deputy asked, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Yes, we are looking for Beatrice Sterling. Is she on the premises?" Beatrice, hearing the deep baritone of a man's voice, fluttered out of the parlor, Cynthia and Margaret trailing curiously behind her. "I am Beatrice Sterling," she announced, squaring her shoulders. "Officer, if this is about the neighborhood watch donation, I already sent a check." "Mrs. Sterling," the man in the charcoal suit interrupted, stepping forward. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am the legal counsel representing Oak and Ivy Holdings, LLC, the legal owner of this estate." Beatrice scoffed, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. "Oak and Ivy? Oh, you must be the holding company that bought our debt. Well, I assure you, Mr. Pendleton, my son is working on a repayment schedule. There's no need for the police to harass us." Arthur didn't blink. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal folder. "Mrs. Sterling, Oak and Ivy Holdings did not buy your debt to set up a repayment plan. We bought the deed to the property in its entirety from the bank 8 months ago to save it from public auction. You do not own this house. You have not owned this house for nearly a year." Cynthia and Margaret exchanged a synchronized look of absolute horror. Beatrice's face flushed red. "That is preposterous," Beatrice shouted, her voice echoing off the chandelier. "We have an understanding with the buyer. They agreed to let us stay." "The buyer," Arthur said smoothly, his voice carrying perfectly to the eavesdropping socialites, "granted you a temporary grace period out of the goodness of her heart. However, due to recent, hostile behavior toward the property owner, that grace period has been immediately revoked." David stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Wait, what do you mean, her heart? Who owns Oak and Ivy Holdings?" Arthur smiled. It was a terrifying smile. He pulled a single, notarized sheet of paper from the top of the stack and handed it to David. "Read the managing director's name, Mr. Sterling." David took the paper, his hands trembling. He scanned the dense legal jargon until his eyes landed on the bold, underlined text at the bottom. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He swayed on his feet, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "David?" Beatrice snapped, losing her patience. "David, what does it say? Stop acting like a fool." "Mom," David whispered, his voice cracking violently. "It's Young. The sole owner of Oak and Ivy Holdings is Young." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, crushing vacuum. Beatrice staggered backward, as if she had been physically struck. "No, no, that's impossible. She's a penniless accountant. She has nothing. Young Hayes is the sole heir to the Hayes Aviation patent estate, currently valued in excess of $20 million, Arthur stated loudly, ensuring the gossiping friends heard every single syllable. "She paid off your $4.5 million foreclosure debt in cash, Mrs. Sterling. She has been secretly funding your utility bills, your property taxes, and your grocery accounts for 8 months to save your son from the humiliation of bankruptcy." Margaret DuPont let out a loud, audible gasp, clutching her mimosa glass. "She owned the house," Arthur continued, stepping closer to Beatrice, "when you forced her to scrub its floors. She owned the house when you insulted her in front of your friends. And, most importantly, she owned the house on Tuesday night when you illegally forced her out into a rainstorm." "This is a lie," Beatrice shrieked, her Chanel suit suddenly looking entirely out of place on her trembling, panicked frame. "This is a forged document. Get out of my house." "It is not your house," Deputy Miller finally spoke up, stepping forward and handing Beatrice a yellow piece of paper. "Ma'am, you have been formally served. This is a 2-hour notice to vacate. You and your son have until 11 a.m. on Monday to remove your personal belongings from the premises. If you are still here at 11:01 a.m., you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." David collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand mahogany staircase, burying his face in his hands. The reality of his cowardice was crashing down on him like an anvil. He had chosen his mother's vicious pride over a woman who had secretly handed him the world. Monday? Beatrice hyperventilated, looking wildly at her friends, who were now backing away toward the door, eager to escape the sinking ship and spread the scandal of the decade. I have nowhere to go. My money is tied up in assets. Your joint accounts have been frozen, as the funds within them belong entirely to my client, Arthur clarified mercilessly. I suggest you start packing, Mrs. Sterling. Oh, and Young sends her regards. She hopes you enjoy the rain. By Friday evening, the scandal had erupted through the affluent zip codes of Connecticut, with the destructive force of a localized hurricane. Cynthia Harrison and Margaret DuPont had not even waited until their town cars reached the end of the manor's sweeping driveway before they began making phone calls. Within hours, the whispered rumors became loud, vicious dinner table conversations. Victoria Caldwell, the president of the Historical Society, immediately struck Beatrice's name from the upcoming charity gala's guest list. Harrison Belmont, the president of the local country club, quietly instructed the front desk that the Sterling's membership, which had secretly been paid from Young's hidden trust for the past 8 months, was now suspended due to insufficient funds and reputational concerns. The walls of Sterling Manor, once a fortress of snobbery, had become a prison of undeniable reality. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The reality of a 72-hour eviction notice had finally cracked Beatrice's impenetrable delusion. She spent Friday night in a state of hysterical denial, drinking the last of the cheap cooking sherry and demanding David fix the situation. But David was paralyzed. He had spent the last 48 hours leaving increasingly desperate voicemails on Young's phone. "Young, please," he had begged, his voice cracking on the 7th message. "I didn't know. I swear to God. I didn't know you bought the house. We need to talk. I love you. Mom is. She's beside herself. We have nowhere to go. Please call me back." There was no response. The silence from Young was louder than Beatrice's screaming. On Saturday morning, panic set in. Beatrice finally realized that no legal loophole was going to save her. She ordered David to start packing the antiques. "We are taking the silver," Beatrice commanded, frantically wrapping a heavy candelabra in old newspapers. "We are taking the Monet replica in the study, the Persian rugs, and the crystal chandelier in the dining room. We will sell them. We can live off the auction money until David gets a promotion." But Arthur Pendleton was a man who left nothing to chance. At 2 p.m. on Saturday, a sharp knock echoed through the house. David answered it to find Gregory Fields, an elite, highly respected estate appraiser from Sotheby's, flanked by 2 private security contractors. "Mr. Sterling," Gregory said politely, handing over a clipboard, "I am here on behalf of Oak and Ivy Holdings. I conducted a quiet appraisal of the estate's interior assets 3 months ago at Miss Hayes's request. I am here to ensure that no fixtures, art, or historical assets belonging to the property are removed." Beatrice stormed into the foyer, clutching a silver teapot. "These are family heirlooms. You cannot steal my family's legacy." Gregory adjusted his glasses, looking at Beatrice with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Mrs. Sterling, according to the bank records, acquired by my client, your late husband collateralized the vast majority of this estate's valuables 15 years ago. The Monet in the study is a $200 print. The Persian rugs are machine-loomed reproductions from a department store. The original family silver was sold to a private dealer in 2008. The teapot you are holding is silver-plated brass, worth approximately $40. Beatrice dropped the teapot. It clattered against the marble floor, the sound shattering the final, fragile illusion of her life. Her husband had lied to her. Her wealth was a mirage. She had treated Young like a peasant, completely oblivious to the fact that she herself was reigning over a kingdom of cheap counterfeits. David slumped against the wall, burying his face in his hands. "Leave it, Mom," he whispered, a hollow, defeated sound. "Just leave it all. We have nothing." By Sunday evening, the Grand Manor looked like a graveyard. The only things Beatrice and David were legally allowed to take were their clothes, personal electronics, and a few boxes of photographs. They had no money for professional movers. David had been forced to rent a beat-up, rust-spotted U-Haul truck using a high-interest credit card, parking the bright orange eyesore directly in front of the grand portico. It was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation. Beatrice sat on a taped-up cardboard box in the empty foyer, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. The woman who had ruthlessly mocked Young's middle-class upbringing was now aggressively calculating how long she could survive in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Monday morning arrived not with the gentle, forgiving light of a new beginning, but draped in heavy, bruised, and ominous clouds. The air hanging over the Connecticut countryside was thick and suffocating, swollen with the undeniable threat of a torrential downpour. It was a poetic, almost theatrical mirroring of the exact weather system that had rolled through on Tuesday night, the night Young had been cast out like unwanted debris. Now, the storm was returning, but this time, Young was the one controlling the thunder. The antique grandfather clock in the grand hallway of Sterling Manor, one of the few genuine pieces left that Beatrice had entirely failed to maintain, chimed a hollow, echoing sound. It was 10:15 a.m. They had exactly 45 minutes before their presence on the property became a criminal offense. Outside, the reality of the Sterling family's catastrophic fall from grace was parked directly on the pristine circular driveway. David had been forced to rent the smallest, cheapest moving truck available, a beat-up, rust-spotted U-Haul that smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and damp cardboard. He had maxed out a high-interest credit card just to secure it for 48 hours. The bright orange and white monstrosity sat in stark, humiliating contrast to the Gothic Revival elegance of the estate's stone portico. David was physically unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant air he had been just a week prior. His designer clothes were severely wrinkled, stained with dust and sweat. Deep, purple bags hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. He had spent the entire weekend trapped in a vicious, agonizing cycle of packing garbage bags and enduring his mother's hysterical, venomous outbursts. Every time he carried a box of old sweaters out to the truck, he felt the burning, judgmental stares of the neighbors. Cynthia Harrison's sleek Mercedes had driven past the gates at a creeping, agonizingly slow pace, no less than 4 times that morning. The entire neighborhood was watching the spectacle of their ruin. Beatrice stood on the top step of the portico, refusing to assist with the physical labor. She clutched a single, scuffed Louis Vuitton handbag to her chest, like a life preserver. She wore her beige trench coat, trying desperately to maintain an air of aristocratic dignity, but she looked entirely frail, hollowed out, and remarkably unremarkable, without the illusion of her wealth to shield her. Her carefully constructed universe had imploded, leaving behind a bitter, terrified old woman who suddenly realized she had no marketable skills, no genuine friends, and exactly $0 to her name. "David, be careful with that box," Beatrice snapped, her voice raspy from days of crying and screaming. "Those are the first edition Hemingways. We can sell those to a dealer in the city." David paused halfway down the stone steps, a heavy cardboard box trembling in his aching arms. He slowly turned his head to look at his mother, his expression entirely deadened. "They aren't first editions, Mom," David said, his voice a hollow, defeated rasp. "The appraiser told us on Saturday. Remember? Dad sold the first editions in 2011 to cover a margin call. These are book club reprints. They're worth about $4 each." Beatrice's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She closed her eyes, swaying slightly on her expensive, impractical heels. "Just put them in the truck, David. Don't speak to me in that tone." "What tone?" David suddenly shouted, the last thread of his patience snapping violently. He dropped the box onto the wet driveway. The cardboard split, spilling the worthless books across the gravel. "The tone of reality? We are homeless, Mom. We have nothing, And we have nothing because you couldn't stop yourself from torturing the only person who actually cared about us. Don't you dare blame me for that wretched girl's deceit, Beatrice shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at him. She set us up. She is a vindictive, common little. The crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway violently cut Beatrice off. It was 10:45 a.m., gliding through the towering wrought iron gates, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a shark, slipping through dark water, was a sleek, immaculate black Lincoln town car. It was followed closely by a white Ford Explorer bearing the bold, unmistakable emblem of the Connecticut County Sheriff's Department. David felt his stomach drop into his shoes. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He watched, paralyzed, as the two vehicles pulled to a smooth, synchronized stop just behind his rusted U-Haul. The driver of the Lincoln, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, stepped out quickly. He opened a massive, black golf umbrella, anticipating the coming storm, and moved to open the rear passenger door. Young Hayes stepped out into the damp, heavy air. David let out a soft, pathetic whimper at the sight of her. The woman standing before him bore no resemblance to the exhausted, subservient wife who had scrubbed his mother's baseboards and cooked their elaborate meals. Young was transformed. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal trench coat over an elegant, high-necked black dress, her posture impeccable, her shoulders squared. Her hair, usually pulled back into a frantic, messy bun, fell in sleek, dark waves around her shoulders. She radiated power, absolute control, and an untouchable, terrifying calm. She didn't look angry. She looked utterly indifferent. And to David, that indifference was infinitely worse than hatred. Arthur Pendleton stepped out of the other side of the car, his ubiquitous leather briefcase in hand, flanked by Deputy Miller. Young, David choked out, stumbling forward over the scattered, worthless books. His hands reached out desperately, trembling in the cold air. Young, please, please, you don't have to do this. We can fix this. Young stopped a few feet away from him. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She simply looked at him, her eyes scanning his disheveled appearance. I'll leave her, David begged, tears immediately spilling down his cheeks, mixing with the dust on his face. He pointed frantically back at Beatrice. I'll cut my mother off entirely. I see it now, Young. I see how toxic she is. I'll do whatever you want. We can stay here, just you and me. I love you, Young. I swear to God, I love you. Young let out a slow, quiet breath. The wind whipped her trench coat around her legs. You don't love me, David, Young said, her voice carrying with crystal clarity over the sound of the rising wind. You love the comfort I provided. You loved having a glorified maid that you could sleep with, and an emotional meat shield to protect you from your mother's cruelty. You loved the idea of a wife, but you possessed absolutely none of the spine required to be a husband. I was weak, David pleaded, falling to his knees on the sharp gravel, entirely abandoning his dignity. I was terrified of her. She controlled the money, the house. I didn't know you had bought it. If I had known. If you had known I had $20 million, you would have treated me like a human being, Young interrupted, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. Is that really the defense you want to go with, David? That you only respect people who can buy your loyalty? David opened his mouth, but the trap had snapped shut. He had no defense. He sobbed, burying his face in his dirty hands. When it mattered most, Young continued smoothly, stepping around his kneeling form. When I was on the floor, apologizing for a simple accident, you let her throw me out into a freezing storm. You told me to go to a hotel while you drank my wine in my house. You cured me of my fear of losing you that night, David. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. Mr. Sterling, these are the finalized divorce filings. Given the length of the marriage, the absolute lack of communal assets generated on your end, and the fact that you are entirely insolvent, I have drafted an ironclad waiver of alimony. You will sign them by tomorrow afternoon, or I will personally ensure you are buried in a legal discovery process so aggressive it will haunt you for the rest of your natural life. Beatrice, unable to help herself, finally stomped down the stone steps. Her pride was a terminal, incurable disease. Even facing the literal police, she could not back down. "You vindictive, ungrateful little wretch," Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with impotent rage, her eyes darting between Young and the deputy. "You plotted this from the beginning. You tricked my son. You manipulated the bank. I will sue you. I will drag your name through the mud of every country club in New England." Young slowly turned her gaze to Beatrice. The older woman visibly shrank under the intense, crushing weight of Young's stare. "Mrs. Sterling," Arthur warned, his tone dangerously low, "any further harassment of my client, or any attempt to defame her character in public, will result in an immediate civil suit for slander. Furthermore, I have an itemized inventory of this estate. If I find so much as a silver spoon missing when we walk through those doors, I will have Deputy Miller arrest you for grand larceny right here on the driveway." Beatrice clamped her mouth shut, her jaw trembling. "I gave you exactly what you asked for, Beatrice," Young said, stepping closer to her former mother-in-law. "You stood in that dining room, you told me it was your house, and you demanded I leave. I simply corrected the paperwork. You are a bitter, cruel, entirely hollow woman. You have nothing left but a fake Chanel suit and a lifetime of bridges you burned yourself." Young looked down at her watch. "It is 10:59 a.m. I strongly suggest you get in that truck." Right on cue, a massive thunderclap rolled across the sky, vibrating in the chests of everyone standing on the driveway. The clouds finally broke, and the freezing rain began to fall in heavy, relentless, driving sheets. David didn't look back at Young again. The reality of his cowardice had crushed him entirely. He slowly pushed himself up from the wet gravel, his shoulders slumped, and walked to the driver's side of the U-Haul. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. Beatrice stood in the pouring rain for a moment longer, her carefully styled hair instantly plastering to her face, her makeup running in dark, pathetic streaks. She looked wildly at the massive stone manor, the only home she had known for 40 years, before she scrambled awkwardly into the passenger seat of the moving truck, slipping heavily on the metal step and letting out a loud, undignified shriek of pain. The U-Haul's engine roared to life with a pathetic, grinding sputter, a cloud of black exhaust coughing from the tailpipe. Young stood under the umbrella Arthur held for her, watching in total, unbroken silence as the rusted truck slowly crawled down the long driveway. The tires spun briefly in the mud before finding traction. The truck passed through the wrought iron gates, turned onto the main road, and disappeared forever into the gray, stormy horizon. Deputy Miller tipped his hat to Young, got into his cruiser, and slowly drove away, leaving Young and Arthur alone in the deafening roar of the rain. Young turned her back to the driveway and looked up at the towering, majestic facade of Sterling Manor. The heavy rain washed over the old stone, scrubbing away the dirt, the pretension, and the heavy ghosts of the past 3 years. "Well," Arthur said gently, his voice a comforting rumble over the storm, "it needs a new roof, completely updated plumbing, and a severe, aggressive exorcism of spectacularly bad taste. What exactly do you want to do with it, Young? You can flip it, sell it to a developer." Young smiled. It wasn't a smile of revenge, but a genuine, luminous expression of freedom. She reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat, pulled out the heavy, antique brass key, and walked up the wet stone steps to the portico. "First," Young said, sliding the key into the heavy, familiar lock of the grand oak door, "I'm going to have a locksmith change every single deadbolt on this property. Then, I think I'll call a commercial contractor, Arthur." She pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the cavernous, empty foyer. Without the tacky rugs and the suffocating presence of Beatrice, the space looked huge, full of light and possibility. "This place has 20 bedrooms," Young said, looking up at the sweeping mahogany staircase she had vacuumed hundreds of times. "It has a massive commercial kitchen. It's entirely secluded and completely secure. I don't want to sell it. I want to rip up the carpets, knock down the walls in the East Wing, and turn it into a sanctuary, a transitional shelter for women who have been thrown out, abandoned, or abused by the people who were supposed to protect them. Women who need a place to land while they get back on their feet. Arthur raised his eyebrows, a look of profound respect crossing his weathered face. That will cost millions to zone and renovate, Young. Good thing my father left me 22, Young replied, turning back to face him from inside the warm, dry foyer. Set up the nonprofit foundation, Arthur. Call it the Richard Hayes House. She looked out at the pouring rain one last time. She saw the spot on the porch where she had shivered, broken, and terrified just days ago. That woman was gone. The victim had been entirely erased, replaced by the architect of her own destiny. Young stepped back, taking a deep, restorative breath of the clean air inside her home, and with a satisfying, echoing, utterly final thud, she firmly shut the door. The story of young Hayes is a masterclass in silent resilience and the absolute devastating power of karma. It proves that true wealth isn't loud, arrogant, or cruel. It's quiet, patient, and strikes exactly when it needs to. David and Beatrice learned the hard way that when you treat people like they are disposable, you might just be throwing away the only parachute you have left. Young didn't just survive the storm, she bought the weather machine. If this story of brutal revenge, self-respect, and ultimate triumph gave you chills, do not keep it to yourself. Like this video to support Young's incredible power move, share it with someone who loves a perfectly executed twist of fate, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life stories of drama, betrayal, and absolute justice. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale.